Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy, North Carolina, Lorraine in Texas, Belle in Texas, Joe in the Inland Empire, Renee in Indiana, Chaim in Florida, Alan in New York City, Christine in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. That's a new name. Welcome, Christine. Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Let me just plug that in over there. Yeah. And I received some very sad news earlier today. One of my best friends in the world, his mom passed away. She was a friend of ours in her own right. And so I'd like to dedicate our learning today. I mean, just to respect privacy, we'll just say Sonia. Okay, Sonia. I don't know her parents' names, but our dear friend Sonia. May her memory always be for a blessing. May the neshama have a great aliyah, and may my friend and his family be comforted in this difficult time. And we say Amen. Okay, we have a very short daf today. It would be the sort of daf I would always do a double in this situation, but we're already running 4 pages ahead. So let's just have a short class. Our daf today is page 60. We begin right near the top of 60a here in Tractate Avoda Zara, the 27th volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our journey through chapter 4. Today, with God's help, we'll complete Mishnah number 8 and open Mishnah 9. Open Mishnah 9 and complete it. Again, with God's help. Whenever we speak about the future and what's gonna happen, we always add God willing, by the grace of God, with God's help. In Hebrew, Bezrat Hashem, with the help of God, or in Yirtzeh Hashem, by the will of God. Because when it comes to the future, we don't tell God his business. God decides what happens in the future. Avoda Zara is all about idolatry, the very strong prohibition against idolatry. As we've discussed a bunch of times, all humans are prohibited in idolatry. Jews by many commandments all over the Torah, including the 10 Commandments. And all people, since we're all the descendants of Noah, so therefore the Noahide, the 7 Noahide commandments which apply to all humans include, I am the Lord your God, right? And you shall not have other gods before me. So, you have to know who God is and not bow down to false gods represented by idols. If something becomes into, we have so many laws and rabbinical decrees to distance us from idolatry. That one that we keep encountering is when it comes to wine, which was very commonly used as a libation in idol worship, in idolatry. The sages were extremely stringent about wine, and therefore, even if we don't have direct evidence that an idolater, took some wine and poured out some of that wine as a libation as part of his idolatry, if he just came into contact with it or caused it to be moved, etc., that's going to render the wine prohibited for Jews, minimally prohibited for drinking, but often, perhaps usually, even prohibited for benefit. Not only can we not drink it, we can't even buy or sell it. We can't benefit from it in any way because the sages are distancing us from idolatry. And let's see how that comes to bear today as we continue and complete our discussion of Mishna number 8 here in chapter 4. Rav Papa says, in a case where a Gentile is pouring the wine from the barrel and a Jew is holding the beaker, which is the translation of kuva, into which it is poured, so the wine is prohibited. And what is the reason? When the wine comes out of the barrel, it comes out by force of the Gentile's action. In a case where a Jew is pouring the wine from the barrel and a Gentile is holding the beaker into which it is poured, the wine is permitted. But if the Gentile tilts the beaker to the side, the wine is prohibited. Either because when he tilted it, wine came out, and for all we know, he was thinking to offer some of that wine that he poured out as a libation to his idolatrous god, or because he stirred, he shook, he caused the wine in the beaker to be agitated, and that also would render it prohibited. Rav Papa says, in the case of this Gentile who carries a sealed wineskin, and a Jew is walking behind him and ensuring that the Gentile does not touch the wine itself, then the law depends on the circumstances. If the wineskin is full, the wine is permitted, as the wine in the wineskin is not shaken. If the wineskin is incompletely filled, the wine is prohibited, as perhaps the wine in the wineskin might have been shaken by the Gentile, which would have the same law as wine poured as a libation. Again, these are very stringent laws to distance us from the Gentiles at this time, who were all idolaters, and so there was always a serious chance that they would, pour out some of the wine. It was almost probably common practice that the idolaters, before they would even drink any wine, they would pour some out as an offering to their idolatry. Right, if the wineskin is, I said that. Let's just read that again. If the wineskin is incompletely filled, the wine is prohibited, as perhaps the wine in the wineskin might have been shaken by the Gentile, which would have the same law as wine poured in a libation, as a libation. In the case of a beaker, which is open on top, if it is full, the wine is prohibited, as perhaps the Gentile might have touched the wine or spilled some. If the beaker is incompletely filled, the wine is permitted, as the Gentile did not touch the wine, and we had no reason to believe he spilled any. Rav Ashi says, in the case of a wineskin, whether it is full or incompletely filled, it is permitted. And what is the reason that the wine is permitted, even if it is shaken within the wineskin? It is because this is not the typical manner of offering a libation, and the sages did not decree, special laws meant to protect us from coming to violate written Torah laws in unusual situations, only in more common situations are there rabbinic decrees that apply. With regard to a wine press, where the grapes are pressed with beams rather than trod by foot. Right, now, we've been talking about the wine press in ancient times where people are walking on the grapes, and that really mattered in case a Gentile was involved in that. And we said that he might not render the grapes and even the grape juice in the wine press that he's trotting on to be prohibited because it's not yet wine, right? It's just grapes and grape juice, and by definition, only when it emerges from the wine press do we call it wine, and only if the Gentile came into contact with the wine after it emerged from the press would he render it prohibited, unless other circumstances applied, which we've been reading about in recent pages. Now, we're going to be talking about a wine press that's a little bit more like what we imagine a wine press, some kind of system of beams that, like an olive press, that crush the grapes. Not people walking around in their bare foot on them, but some kind of a system to crush the grapes. And so interesting, the system, the nature of the system that is used is going to matter. Did the Gentile simply stand on a beam and the beam was crushing the grapes? Or is he turning a wheel that pushes down the beam? Or is he turning a wheel that moves a belt that pushes down the beam? In each of these cases, the force that the Gentile is exerting in order to crush the grapes is one further step removed from the actual crushing, and that's going to have an effect on the law in this situation. With regard to a wine press where the grapes are pressed with beams rather than trod by foot, Rav Papi deemed permitted wine that is produced by a Gentile, as the Gentile does not touch the wine. Rav Ashi, and some say it was Rav Shimi bar Ashi, deemed the wine prohibited. And the Gemara comments, in a case where the wine is pressed by means of the Gentile's direct force, everyone agrees that the wine is prohibited. They disagree when the wine is pressed by means of a force generated by his force. Again, adding a wheel or adding a belt on top of a wheel, etc. Conversely, there are those who say that in a case where the wine is pressed by means of a force that is generated by the force that's generated by the Gentile, everyone agrees that the wine is permitted because his force is further attenuated from actually crushing the grapes. They disagree when the wine is pressed by means of the Gentile's direct force. And the Gemara relates there was an incident in which wine was pressed by means of a force generated by the Gentile's force, and Rav Yaakov from Nehar Pekod deemed the wine prohibited. Even 2 steps removed, he deemed it prohibited. Now the Gemara relates there was a certain barrel that split lengthwise from top to bottom, and a certain Gentile jumped up and encircled it with his arms in order to prevent the wine from spilling. Rav from Bar Papa, and some say it was Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, deemed it permitted to sell the wine to Gentiles, as the wine was rendered prohibited only for drinking, but not with regard to deriving benefit. The Gemara notes this statement applies only in a case where it split lengthwise. But where the barrel split widthwise and the Gentile held the top and the bottom halves together, it is permitted even for drinking. And what is the reason that the wine is permitted? The Gentile is merely performing the action of weighing down the top, like as if you put a brick on top of it, and he is not doing anything to the wine. He's not really interacting with the wine. He's just holding the barrel together that was already there. And the Gemara relates there was a certain Gentile who was found standing in a wine press. And Rav Ashi said if there is enough wine in the wine press that it is moist enough to moisten other items, the wine press requires rinsing and requires a more thorough cleansing, as the Gemara will explain when we get to it in a couple weeks on page 74b. But if there is not enough wine to moisten other items, then merely rinsing is sufficient for it. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. We move on to Mishnah 9. In the case of a Gentile who is found standing next to the wine collection vat, if there is a loan owed by the owner of the wine vat to the Gentile, the wine is prohibited. Let's get the picture. The Gentile didn't touch the wine. He didn't touch the vat that the wine is inside of. He's just standing there. Why would we render the wine prohibited? According to the law of if a wine comes into contact with the wine of a Jew, that wine becomes prohibited. He didn't come into contact with it. What's the issue here? And what is having a loan that the Gentile lent money to the Jew, what does that have to do with it? In this case, since the Gentile maintains that he has a right to the owner's property because the Jew owes him money, he has no compunctions about touching the wine. But if there is no loan owed by the owner of the wine vat to the Gentile, then the wine remains permitted, as it is assumed that the Gentile did not touch the wine. That was not his. He had no rights to anything on that property. He was just visiting. He's just standing there, didn't touch anything. There's no reason to assume he did touch it. But if he has some kind of rights, presumably if he's a landlord, that would also be covered. But certainly if he has lent money to the Jew, and as we'll see, has some kind of a lien on his property, then he could feel comfortable coming in and touching the wine, and that would render the wine prohibited. We're not sure that he did that, but we have to be concerned that he did that, and that's why it would render the wine prohibited. If a Gentile fell into the wine collection vat, right, the vat that receives the wine from the wine press, and emerged from it, or if he measured the wine in the wine press with a pole without touching it with his hands, or if he cast a hornet out of the wine by means of a pole, and the pole touched the wine, or where the Gentile was removing the foam that was on the top of a fermenting barrel of wine. So with regard to all of these cases, there was such an incident. These are actual incidents where there were rulings. And the sages said that the wine may be sold to Gentiles, as it is permitted to derive benefit from the wine, but not to drink it. Right? In other words, the law, the rabbinic prohibition on a Gentile touching our wine, that was violated. So that's going to render the wine prohibited for benefit. We have no reason to believe that the Gentile poured that wine as a libation, which would render it prohibited even for benefit. But it's totally prohibited for drinking. And Rabbi Shimon deems the wine permitted even for drinking. In a case where a Gentile took the barrel of wine and he threw it in his anger into the wine collection vat, this was an incident that occurred, and the sages deemed the wine fit for drinking. That's Mishnah 9. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that in the case of a Gentile who was found standing next to a wine collection vat, if the owner of the vat owes money to the Gentile, the wine is prohibited. Shmuel says, and this law applies only when the loan includes the qualification that the Gentile has a lien on that wine, as only then does the Gentile feel that he is entitled to touch the wine. It's not some general right that he feels he has just because the Jew owes him money. But if part of the loan agreement was that if the loan is not paid back, he has a lien on this vat of wine, then for sure we have cause to believe that the Gentile might have put his hand in the wine or drank from the wine or even actually made a libation from the wine. Rav Ashi said the wording of the Mishnah is also precise according to Shmuel's interpretation. As we learned in the following Mishnah on page 61a, Mishnah 10 that we'll come to tomorrow, God willing, in the case of a Jew who renders the wine of a Gentile permitted by treading the Gentile's grapes so that the wine can be sold to Jews. In other words, a Jew basically rents out a wine press that belongs to Gentiles, but then the Jew does all the wine production, so that would keep it permitted for Jews. And he then places the wine in the Gentile's domain until he sells it. He fabricated the wine on the premises of the Gentile's property, right, where the wine press is and where his storage facility is. And then while the Jew is going out to make an arrangement to sell the barrel of wine that he manufactured on the Gentile's property, so that means that now the wine is unsupervised while the Jew leaves and goes to make a deal. So what's this going to depend on? If we have any reason to believe that the Gentile might have gone into that barrel, touched the wine, drank the wine, made a libation out of the wine, that's going to render the wine prohibited. But if we have cause to believe that the wine was stored in such a way that the Gentile would not in any way come into contact with it, then it could remain permitted. So when can we make either assumption? And he then places the wine in the Gentile's domain until he sells it. The law depends on the circumstances. If that one, the Gentile, writes for the Jew, I receive money from you in payment for the wine, even though he did not yet receive the actual payment, the wine remains permitted for drinking and for benefit. It's the property of the Jew. This is because the wine is considered the Jew's property and there's no reason to suppose that the Gentile might touch it. But in a case where the Jew desires to remove the wine and the Gentile does not allow him to do so until the Jew gives him the money due to him, and this was an incident that occurred in Beit Shan, and the sages deemed the wine prohibited, right? Because the Gentile is still exercising control over that wine. He hasn't been paid for it, so from his point of view, he can dip his cup into it and take a glassful. And that would, of course, render it prohibited. Rav Ashi explains the reason that the wine is prohibited is that the Gentile does not allow the Jew to remove the wine. And therefore, the Gentile is considered to have some degree of ownership of the wine. Therefore, one can infer that if the Gentile allows him to remove the wine is permitted, even though the Jew still owes him money. One may conclude from the Mishnah that in order for the wine to be prohibited, we require the loan to include the qualification that the Gentile has a lien on that wine. And the Gemara affirms one may conclude Shmuel's principle from this Mishnah. Next topic. And we're going to cover this quickly, but it's crazy. Right? The Mishnah mentioned that if a Gentile fell into the wine collection vat, right? I guess it's like a wino's dream to fall into a vat of wine. And he emerged. It is not prohibited to derive benefit from the wine. We're like, wait a minute. If he stuck his finger in it, it would be prohibited. But if his whole body falls in, it's going to be permitted? Especially if he's like a wino like I just described and he falls in the vat. Probably he's drinking it while he's in it. How could the wine remain permitted? Rav Papa says, the sages taught this law only in a case where the Gentile emerged from the vat dead. Okay, the wine would be permitted, but I don't think anybody would want to drink it if a guy drowned in it. Oh my gosh. But if he emerged alive, no, the wine is prohibited. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that the wine is prohibited? And Rav Papa said, since the Gentile was rescued from death when he was pulled out of the vat and he didn't drown in it, he considers that day like their festival day. And he would certainly offer the wine as an idolatrous libation in Thanksgiving. And therefore, the whole vat is prohibited. Now, that's a major loss to the owner of the vat. Let's be realistic about that. And that's the end of that topic. Next, the Mishnah teaches that if a Gentile measured the wine in the wine press with a pole, he didn't touch it with his hand, he touched it with a pole. Or if he cast a hornet out of the wine by means of a pole, or if he removed the foam on top of the fermenting barrel of wine. With regard to all of these cases, there was such an incident, and the sages said that the wine may be sold to Gentiles, but one may not drink it. Permitted for benefit, prohibited for consumption. Avoda bar Ahava says, may blessings rest upon Rabbi Shimon's head, as his reasoning is clear. When he deems the wine permitted, he deems it permitted even with regard to drinking. And when he deems the wine prohibited, he deems it prohibited even with regard to deriving benefit from it. An easier ruling to remember. Rav Chia, the son of Abba bar Nachmani, says that Rav Chisda says that Rav says, and some say that Rav Chisda says that Zeri says. The law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Either it's permitted even for drinking or it's prohibited even for benefit.
And there are those who say that Rav Chisda said, Abba Bar Chanan said to me, this is what Zeri says, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Despite this, however, the Gemara concludes, but the halacha is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And we do have these distinctions between benefit and consumption. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Mishnah teaches with regard to the case where a Gentile took a barrel of wine and threw it in his anger into the wine collection vat. This was an incident that occurred, and the sages deemed the wine fit for drinking. Rav Ashi says, with regard to any form of contact through which a Zav renders an object ritually impure, in a case where a Gentile has that same kind of contact with wine, he renders it wine used for a libation. In the case of any form of contact through which a Zav does not transmit Tuma, leaving an object ritually pure, a Gentile does not render the wine with which he has contact wine that is used for a libation. Right? So here, to clarify, we are borrowing concepts about when a contact between a person and a substance is significant contact. We're borrowing in the realm of, does an idolater render wine prohibited, because we're concerned that we might come to violate the prohibition on idolatry, right? So we're borrowing this element of the law for this field from a different field of the law, which is tuma, ritual impurity, right? There are many things that can cause ritual impurity, like coming into contact with a dead body, a dead creeping thing, a man who's had a seminal emission, a woman who is menstruating, substances that are already impure from having come into contact with one of those sources, depending on the situation. We've talked about this many times, but just for people who are new, ritual impurity has nothing to do with hygiene. It's just a system of laws that apply only to Jews. And really, the real importance of them, because now we're all assumed to be tameh, was when the temple was standing in Jerusalem and tithing was being carried out in its complete form. And so teruma, which was the first of every tithe of produce from the field, was given to a priest. It had to be ritually pure, and the priest had to be in a state of ritual purity in order to consume that teruma, that first tithe that was given to priests, and all people bringing offerings and the offerings themselves that would be brought into the holy temple had to be in a state of ritual purity. There's nothing that you could look at a person or a quantity of produce or a liquid, depending on the situation, and look at it and tell that it's ritually impure or ritually pure. You just have to know the history of that person or of that object, and therefore it has to be guarded from coming into contact with tuma, so that if it does, either it's going to be rendered disqualified, or in this situation where something could be purified, it is purified. So why are we talking about tuma, ritual impurity, and tahara, ritual purity? Now, when we're talking about whether an idolater has rendered a wine prohibited or permitted due to idolatry, because they're talking about contact. What kind of contact is considered significant contact, right? So obviously the idolater puts his finger in the wine, he's had contact with it. If he tilts that glass to his lips and drinks from it, he's had contact with it. If he pours it out on the ground. In all these cases, of course, the wine is prohibited, and not only prohibited for benefit, but prohibited for consumption by Jews. What if he just picked up the vessel that the wine is in, and he didn't pour any out, and he didn't shake it, but he has moved it using his force, right? It's the Gentile's force that moved it. That's the type of question that would not be so clear, and we'd have to look into these kinds of elements of the law to answer. And so now they're going to borrow and say, in a situation where if a zav, right, which is a man who's had a seminal emission and therefore he's ritually impure,
until he immerses in a ritual bath, in a mikveh, and waits for nightfall. And then, he could become pure again and enter the Holy Temple when it's standing in Jerusalem. So in a situation where a Zav would render something Tameh, right? If he touched it, obviously. But if he threw it or he caused it to move, not so clear. And that's what we're examining here, right? So what we're talking about is where the Gentile took a barrel of wine, presumably an open one, and he threw it in anger at the vat, right? And so the wine that he caused to be moved has now mixed with the wine in the vat. So if we're going to render all that wine prohibited, especially even for benefit, then the Jew who owns all that wine in the vat will have a significant loss, right? And it's clear in this situation that the Gentile did not intend to pour that wine out as a libation, and he didn't come into direct contact with it. But he caused wine to be moved in his anger, and then the wine that he caused to be moved that was in that barrel maybe now comes into contact, mixes with the wine in the vat. So what's going to happen, right? And what they're going to say is, well, is this a kind of situation where if a Zav took, some quantity of liquid, I guess, and, threw it at something else and it mixed with it, right? He moved the liquid, even though he didn't come into contact with it. Would that render the liquid impure? Or if there was, let's say, grain in a bag and he threw it, if he touched the grain, for sure it became impure. If he picked up the bag, maybe. Is that the kind of contact where a Zav imparts Tuma? I don't remember offhand. But the question is, if he would, then we could apply that same principle of law over to that the Gentile would render the wine prohibited. So let's reread. With regard to the case where a Gentile took a barrel of wine and he threw it in his anger into the wine collection vat, this was an incident that occurred and the sages deemed the wine fit for drinking. So presumably, there's no reason to think that this was a libation, that he did it on purpose, that he had any direct contact with it. So we're going to have a lenient ruling that preserves the wine as permitted for its owner. Wonderful ruling for him. Rav Ashi says, with regard to any form of contact through which a Zav renders an object Tameh, in a case where a Gentile has that same kind of active contact or indirect contact, with wine, he would render it wine used as a libation, i.e. prohibited. In the case of any form of contact through which a Zav does not transmit Tuma, leaving the object tahor, ritually pure, if a Gentile does that same action on wine, he would not render the wine with which he had that kind of contact wine used as a libation, and therefore it remains permitted. Rav Huna raised an objection to Rav Ashi from the Mishna. With regard to the case where the Gentile took the barrel of wine and he threw it in his anger into the wine collection vat, this was an incident that occurred in Beit Shan, and the sages deemed the wine fit for drinking. Okay, so it sounds like that if what they're objecting to using this story, because it remained fit for drinking in the story, if they're using that now as an objection to this principle, it must mean that if a Zav took the same action, he would have rendered it Tameh, and here the Gentile did not render the wine prohibited. Is that what's happening? Let's see. And this was an incident that occurred in Beit Shan, and the sages deemed the wine fit for drinking. So one may infer that if the Gentile threw the wine in his anger, yes, the wine in the vat would remain permitted. But if it was not in his anger, the wine is not permitted, even though in the case of a Zav, if he threw an object at a vessel, it would not render the vessel impure. So it is the same kind of action of a Zav, but here in the case of wine and the idolater, which should be a more stringent case because it deals with idolatry, it's only because the Gentile threw it in anger. But if he just threw it, period, not in anger, where we have reason to believe he was doing this as a libation, then the wine would end up prohibited. Rav Ashi replied, the Mishnah there is referring to a case where the barrel was not actually thrown. Rather, it is propelled by the Gentile and again propelled by him until it reaches the vat. Therefore, if the Gentile did not do so in anger,
there is reason to be concerned that he might have touched the wine. It wasn't just one throw. There was, some deliberate movement. So if we can ascribe that it was just anger, and you wanted to break the barrel, take it out on the barrel, okay, then there's no reason to believe that idolatry crept into this. But if it was a deliberate action that he took, which results in the barrel ending up in the wine, and we don't know what his motive was, it wasn't just some kind of hissy fit, then it might have been because of idolatry, and that would require us to render, or the sage who's being asked, to render the wine in the vat prohibited. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9. We'll pick it up with Mishnah number 10 tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, on page 61a. Now let me take some questions. Bill, so the first windmill we can point to historically is relatively near the sages in Bavel, right, Babylonia, being in Persia only 2 centuries after them. However, that's only the first windmill we can verify by documentary evidence. So some scholars think there may have already been a few around. So if a Gentile owned the windmill being used to crush the grapes, what is the law? Bill is asking, can we say that this is the force of the force of the force? Is it the force of the Gentile? He owns it. But I bet you asked that before we were looking at this other case where the Jew could sort of rent, or not even rent, but supervise the production even on the premises of the Gentile. So if the Jew is supervising this, that's not going to render it prohibited. The fact that the Gentile owns it. If the Gentile just manufactured the wine and the Jew wasn't supervising it, then for sure it's going to be prohibited because we don't know what happened over there on that premises. That's how I would read that. Lucy, maybe one of the reasons the rules about wine are so strict is because wine is used at home on Shabbos and other festival rituals. The sacred use of wine is not limited to the temple, but pervades Jewish home prayer life, for sure. And we've seen that in some of the definitions of what constitutes idolatry and what doesn't constitute idolatry is, by comparison and extension, to rituals that were conducted in the Holy Temple. Like, for instance, did the idolater treat an animal in such a way that is comparable to us bringing an animal sacrifice when the temple is standing? So there's definitely the analog, in comparison to what we do, and certainly wine is an important libation for us, right, in home worship, and it was also an important thing when the temple stood. But I would go further and say that wine was the most commonly used substance, even among the idolaters, for their libations. We don't have to compare it to us to know that they are always using wine and typically spilling wine before they drink it as a libation to their God, and therefore, wine is the most likely substance to be used in their idolatry, and therefore what the sages require us to be the most stringent in avoiding. And that stringency persists because even today, when there's very little idolatry, at least in the Western world, nevertheless, for wine to be kosher, even though it might have been manufactured on the property of someone we know has never, in many generations, had anything to do with idolatry, nonetheless, wine is not kosher unless it's supervised by a competent, halakhic authority from beginning to end of the process. And that's why, if you're going to be a pious Jew, there's wonderful wine that you can drink. There's delicious, amazing kosher wine. But, I don't know, maybe there's 100, maybe 200 brands of kosher wine, and you can't drink the other 10,000 or 20,000 brands of non-kosher wine. Eileen, how do we apply this today when we buy wine from the wine store or from the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, or when we are having wine with non-Jewish friends, asking for a friend from Toronto? It's a real concern. We talked about this a little bit a couple days ago. That can a non-Jew handle your wine, right? If it's sealed in the bottle, he can handle the wine. It's not going to render it non-kosher that he touched your wine bottle. If it's non-mevushal wine, which means it was not flash pasteurized, and a Gentile opens or pours from an open bottle, that will render it disqualified for a Jew to drink it. Because it's non-mevushal, the idea is it's like the wine is still maturing. If it's mevushal wine that was flash pasteurized, it was finished, so it will not be rendered disqualified if a non-Jew pours that wine for you. He could do that in like a kosher restaurant that has a non-Jewish waiter. He could pour non-mevushal wine for you. But mevushal wine would have to be poured by a Jewish server. So that's one of the sort of nuances that are more modern that we don't talk about here. And so the sort of the laws of kashrut, of what is kosher for us to consume and not, have developed in response to modern questions that didn't exist at the times of the sages. And so your question is a really good question, and I just gave a very general answer. So you should consult with a rabbi and get a proper answer, or at least do some research online, because I am not a rabbi and I don't issue halakhic rulings, and I'm just answering to the best of my ability. And finally, Bill, well, now hold on about the Gentile who nearly drowned in the vat. If he's pulled out by fellow idolaters, sure, I can follow the logic, but if he's pulled out by Jews and or Noachites, wouldn't it be just as likely that he might attribute his salvation to Hashem and abandon his idolatry in response? A wonderful outcome to the story, but as always, the sages are just concerned about human nature and not what did happen, but what could happen. And so, no matter who pulled him out, he might go, oh, thank God, or thank his God, and pour some wine out as a libation, and then the wine is prohibited. That's what I've got for us tonight, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.